So hello everyone, I'm Derek Keats and I'm here as part of the sixth webinar hosted by Nedbank, JCSE at Wits University and EE Business Intelligence. The webinar is all about living in a connected world, who owns my data and why should I care? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about who owns your data and why you should care. So let's get started. So first of all, who am I? I am a former biology professor. I was a biology professor for some 15 years. And during that time, I also had a strong interest in technology. And I eventually moved into university management. And I spent 10 years responsible for IT in two universities. The last one being Wits University. I left there and I started consulting and working with some fintech startups, and I've been doing that work with fintechs now for 9 years. I'm currently part of a business called OnoConnect. We are a unified payment business focused on small merchants primarily, but we're not merchant facing. We do the processing on behalf of payment processors that are focused on smaller merchants, and you may know us as the back-end engine behind Yoko Payments, which is the largest payment organization in South Africa focused on small merchants. That's where I come from, and in that organization, one of my responsibilities lies in the area of compliance, and that includes cybersecurity compliance and compliance to the various things that have to be done in a financial technology organization. So with that background, let's look at your data and where it's created. So anytime you do anything on social media, you're creating data. Anytime you go visit a healthcare practitioner, you are creating data. Anytime you use Google Maps and use it to drive your car, you are creating data, or walk around for that matter, you're creating data. If you do any banking, you're creating data. If you travel, especially air travel, you are creating data. If you're watching Netflix or some other online source of entertainment, you are creating data. In fact, everything that you do that involves any kind of computing device with an internet connection creates data from you and from the activities that you engaged in. So if we're going to talk about ownership of data, we need to understand what ownership means. And this may seem a little crazy that I would be saying we need to understand what ownership means, right? Everybody understands what ownership means. I own this little device I have in my hand, and that's what ownership is. But it's not quite that simple. So let's just look at it from the basic principles first. So ownership means holding exclusive rights and control over an asset, an object, land, real estate, or the expression of an idea, the so-called intellectual property. Now, an asset is usually referred to as property, hence the concept of intellectual property. And it's obviously easier to understand when you're thinking about physical property like a house. We all know what it means to own a house. But actually, ownership is actually expressed in terms of the rights of the owner with respect to the asset that is his or her property. And ownership is a human construct. It's not something that exists in nature. It's a human construct that is typically codified in law, and it would not exist without either some sort of social or legal boundaries that are set in terms of the ownership of assets. So keep all those things in mind. So I'm going to use copyright as an example because I think everybody's got some sort of familiarity with copyright. So ownership is usually expressed in terms of multiple rights in copyright and other forms of ownership as well. So in copyright, the rights include the right to protection under the law. So if someone takes your work and goes and publish it and claims it as their own, you have a recourse. You have a right to produce copies and sell them or give them away, whatever you want to do. You have a right to control the conditions under which people use your copyrighted materials. You have a right to create derivative works. So if you write a book and somebody wants to make a movie of it, they can't just take your book and go make a movie. They have to get your permission, and that usually typically involves paying some money. You have a right for the import or export of your work. You have a right to transmit it by electronic means. You have a right of performance or display. So if you write a poem, somebody can't just get on TV and read it without your permission. And you have the right of attribution. That means that someone uses your material, they have to say it's yours, they have to associate it with you in some way. And you have a right to sell or cede some or all rights to other people. What I typically do, I'm a photographer, so what I typically do with my photos is I give them away, but I require attribution. I'm able to do that because there are licenses that make use of these particular rights of copyright. Now, of course, copyright is not exactly the same in all jurisdictions. There's considerable geographical variation in both the copyright law and how it's applied. But in principle, these are the rights that are included in owning copyright. So these rights define ownership. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. We're going to move on and talk about limitations on ownership. So ownership can have limitations and it can have moral responsibilities. So copyright, for example, may be limited by the doctrine of fair use. So fair use doctrine means I can take, for example, a short excerpt from say a Trevor Noah YouTube video and then use it to parody it or to create a criticism or analysis of it. And I don't need any particular permissions to do that, although it's not the same necessarily in all jurisdictions, as I said. Copyright can expire or usually expires after a set period, and this again varies geographically. Land ownership as another form of ownership can have restrictions on the ownership to allow people free passage. So for example, if I live in Canada and I build a cabin by a river, I can't put up a fence and block access to the river. In South Africa, I can. So those particular restrictions can vary geographically. Ownership may be appropriated for the public good. So own land and a road needs to cut across the corner of your land. That land can be appropriated. You may be paid or you may not be paid depending on the jurisdiction. So these are some of the ways in which ownership can have limitations and carry with it moral responsibilities. Okay, so having said all of that, thinking back to the rights inherent in copyright and the notion of limitations and moral responsibilities, let's look at the physical world and the digital world and see how they're different. So there are two types of entities. There are rivalrous entities. These are things that can't be in two places at once. The physical things like my glass here, things like my cell phone here, or as in the case of the image here, like my car. So if I park my car in the Karoo as I did here, and I go walking to look for birds, and you come along and you jump in my car, turn on the ignition and drive off in it, you've stolen it. It can't be in two places at once. You can't have it at the same time as I have it. You have it, I own it, you've stolen it, unless I've loaned it to you, of course. So that's the nature of entities, rivalrous entities. And most physical things are rivalrous entities. You can't have them two people can't have them at the same time. There are some physical entities like the atmosphere, for example, which are probably closer to being non-rivalrous, since we don't package up the atmosphere and sell it to people to breathe, although that may come one of these days. So non-rivalrous entities can be in more than one place at the same time, and they're obviously mostly typically in digital format. So my photograph of this amazing grass owl here, it can be in thousands of places at the same time, And having it in 1,000 places doesn't necessarily inherently cause me any harm. Unless, of course, I wanted to sell it and I wanted to retain all copyright, and somebody took it and used it, then they would be violating one of the rights inherent in my copyright. But if I've given away the copyright, except for those two restrictions that I mentioned, then it doesn't do me any harm if it's in 1,000,000 places. And it can be in 1,000,000 places at once. So rivalrous entities are familiar, and this is the kind of ownership that we typically think about when we're thinking about owning things. But non-rivalrous entities are mostly, we're not familiar with thinking of ownership in relation to these non-rivalrous entities. Traditionally, copyright would have been would have been manifest in a physical thing, a book or a magazine. But today, of course, copyright also applies to digital non-rivalrous entities. Makes it a little more complicated than it used to be in the old days. Okay, so taking those two entities in mind, where does data fit? Well, data, of course, is non-rivalrous. So let's think about what ownership means in relation to your data. So as I said, data is intrinsically a non-rivalrous entity. Ownership's only meaningful where it's defined in law and the law is enforced. There can be social conventions that also define ownership, but for all intents and purposes in the modern world, ownership is only meaningful where it is defined in law and where that law is enforced. And it's defined in terms of rights. Now, until recently, you asked me, what does ownership mean in relation to your data? I would have said, I have no idea. But in the last few years, we've been able to answer this question because countries have developed legislation, data privacy and data protection legislation that defines certain rights that the originator of the person about whom the data is concerned hold. And those rights partially define ownership of your data. Perfect, but you can consider that those rights are basically what it means, because there aren't any other rights that are explicitly defined in relation. So there is a tricky challenge with data, with your personal data, because on the one side, sorry about that. On the one side, there is the consideration of privacy or privacy, as I getting them mixed up since I have a North American accent living in South Africa, but let's call it privacy. So on the left-hand side here, you've got privacy. On the right-hand side, you've got functionality and convenience. Now, you can't have perfect privacy and lots of functionality and convenience in most circumstances that involve data. So usually you're going to give up some control of your data in exchange for which you're going to gain some functionality or convenience. That's the conventional view. So you might give up your street address, for example, in order to be able to do banking. But you would probably not give up your street address to be able to play a game on Steam or something like that. You might give up your phone number in order to be able to chat with your friends so that they can find you on WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal or whatever app you're on. You would be willing to probably allow someone to access the phone number in order to make that chat connection. You might give up your email address in order to participate in a social network. But the question then becomes, what happens to those data once they have been used? Okay, so I mentioned the data privacy and data protection. So the the EU, the European Union has introduced legislation a couple of years ago called the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. This is very well known in terms of data protection and the requirements that exist in relation to someone who's going to obtain and process your data. And in South Africa, we have this year, or actually last year, come into force the Protection of Personal Information Act, or POPIA as it's known. POPIA and GDPR are pretty similar. There's almost a 100% overlap between the two, with some notable exceptions, but in general, we can consider them to be similar. So I'm going to talk about rights from the GDPR, which I'm a little bit more familiar with because it's been around for longer, and the business I work with is actually registered in the Netherlands, which is why I say I live in Johannesburg and work in Amsterdam. So in the GDPR, there are two key role players: the data subject, so that's you, and the data controller, which is the entity who is accessing and going to do something with data. So you go open a bank account, the data controller will be the bank. If you sign up for Facebook, then Facebook will be the data controller. So your rights are defined with respect to a given data controller, and data controllers may also use data processors to further process the data, and a data processor might use another one and another one and another one and so on. So it becomes quite complicated, which is one of the reasons why this is, except in exceptional cases, this is a difficult law to enforce. And with POPIA, the data controller is called the responsible party, and the data processor is called the operator. But I've heard legal people using those interchangeably, as if calling it a data controller, even though they're talking about POPIA, calling it the data processor, because people, I think, are more familiar with the POPIA being much more recent. So what are the ownership rights that you are granted in GDPR and other related legislations? One is the right to information. So if someone has information about you, you should be able to know what information they have and what they're doing with it. You have a right to rectification, which means if they have information about you and something is wrong, like maybe they have your address wrong, or maybe they spelled your first name wrong, you have a right to correct that and ensure that it is correct when the data are further processed. You have a right to access the data. That's straightforward. If you've given consent, you have a right to withdraw consent. Consent is a whole kettle of fish that worth a webinar on its own. And you have the right to object to what the people are doing with the data. Sorry, there's a mosquito. You have a right to object to what people are doing with the data. If they're processing it in ways that you didn't agree with, you can object to that. And you have a right to object to automated processing. So that's an interesting one, because it applies to certain situations. Like if you apply for insurance, for example, and an automated system does some calculations, runs an algorithm, and turns you down, you have a right to go and say, I demand that a human intervene here and have a look at my application because something's gone wrong in data processing. This is in the EU that this is defined. And you have a right to be forgotten. This is a very important right. So that means that you have a right to tell whoever has your data to delete all of it. Now, this right is obviously not absolute, because if it was, I would go to the bank and I would get a house loan, and then I would tell the bank, I want to be forgotten. Well, obviously, the bank isn't going to forget me until I've paid back my loan, and they may not even forget me then, but for other reasons. So this is not an absolute right, but if you want to have your account deleted on Facebook, for example, you can do so, and you have that right that everything is deleted, but it doesn't always work. So if you look at the recent clamor of people leaving WhatsApp, you have a right to be forgotten, so you can delete your account and all your account data will be deleted, but all the interactions you've had with other people will still exist on their accounts. And to me, this is a violation of the GDPR. I don't know how they get away with it, but one of these days they're going to get hit. Penalty there. And then you have a right to data portability. Typically, this means you can get your data somehow. It might be a printout, or it might be on a memory stick, or it might be downloadable from a website. Doesn't necessarily mean that you can import it into some other system. But we'll come to that in a minute with respect to banking. And then POPIA has the interesting aspect to it that it includes and covers all juristic persons, not just human beings. So companies, universities, societies, any kind of organization, all have the same rights defined under POPIA. At the moment, as far as I know, there's only 2 countries in the world that include juristic persons in all juristic persons in their data protection regulations. So why should you care? That's what we're here to talk about. Why should you care about ownership of your data? So if you're a data subject, is your personally identifiable information secure in the hands of the data controller? Do you know what they're doing with it? We've had some significant breaches. South Africa, one last year that involved a company that does vetting for loans, credit ratings, and things like that on behalf of banks was breached, and a number of banks had prominent data exposed. And so your data can end up in the wrong hands. Are you happy with that? What could be the result? At the simple end, you could be a victim of some kind of marketing scam. So someone's got your phone number, they know a little bit about you, they call you up and say, hey, I'm from Vodacom, or I'm from Nedbank, or whatever. And typically they're not. They're second-tier marketers, and they're trying to sell you something. Most of the time, you actually something that you need. So you can be a victim of a marketing thing, but that's probably I don't like it, but it's not necessarily too harmful compared to some of the other things. You could receive spam. That's another thing. If someone's got your email address, you could be a victim of a scam. So someone could, having learned something about you through the data that's been leaked, call you up and say, hey, I hear you've bought some Bitcoin. I've got a really good deal on Ethereum, and you're going to make more money than you ever make on Bitcoin. Then you go and you invest, and they take your money and run away. All of these things can happen if your data is not safe, kept safe. Your reputation can be harmed. I know a couple of friends of mine had their accounts hacked on Facebook. The hacker sent out videos. Those videos were actually links to sites that probably most people wouldn't want to go and have a look at. And that person's reputation, if they didn't know that their account was hacked, that person's reputation was harmed. Then there's phishing. Phishing is usually where most contemporary cyber attacks begin. Someone sends you an email and says, click this link to do something, and then you go to log in, and they capture your password, and then they've got your username and password on some account, and then they can get in. They can do other nasty stuff once they're inside your systems. The big Twitter breach of last year, where the accounts of some prominent people were exposed, it started with a phishing scam, and one of the employees of Twitter fell for it. The attackers got inside Twitter and were able to get access to other things once they were inside, using that person's account details. And then there's identity theft, where someone pretends to be you, signs up for some service, takes out as happened to a friend of mine, bid on hire purchase, and then disappears. And then somebody comes looking for you, and you have no idea about this bid, but someone is impersonated. And those identity theft things can take an enormous amount of time and effort to get out of once you're stuck in one of them. You don't want this to happen. So as a data subject, you want to be sure that your data is protected. You want to be sure that the people that are processing your data are doing it in such a way that it's not exposed to malicious things. If you're a data controller, excuse me, well, it's the law, and you're required to protect personally identifiable information under law, under GDPR and POPIA and many other related legislation around the world. You must keep it secure at all times, so that means you must have good cybersecurity in place, and you must follow good, solid, modern cybersecurity practices, keeping systems updated, zero trust, and all of those great things, which I could talk about for hours. You must also comply with data privacy and protection regulations, including the rights of the data subject as defined in regulations. And in most jurisdictions, the fines for non-compliance are massive. In South Africa, it's 10 million rand. In other jurisdictions like the EU for the GDPR, it is significantly more than that. So, these are just some of the reasons why you should. Now, it's interesting. I was talking about data portability earlier. One of the challenges with data is that there's considerable friction in moving the data around, and leads to you being stuck in some circumstance because you can't move the data easily. So when I came to South Africa in 1987, I had spent 2 years in Zimbabwe. I had a bank account with Barclays. I was walking down Adderley Street in Cape Town, and I saw a bank that had blue colors just like Barclays. It had even had similar fronts to the banks. Well, obviously, I didn't realize at the time that it had been Barclays, but they had pulled out. So I was gravitated to that color. So for no other reason, it wasn't that it was a great bank or anything like that. I just went there for the blue color and set up my account. And I'm still there. Many times in the past, I've thought, let me just change banks because some reason or the other that I've long forgotten. But it has always proven too difficult to do. And that is largely because of the amount of data. If I could go to the bank and say, give me all my data, and I could go to yet another bank and say, here's my data, just set me up with everything that I had at the other bank, and I will now be your customer. It doesn't work that way, of course, and there is considerable amount of friction in moving the data around, changing your bank because largely of data. Then comes the open banking standard and that has been developed in Europe and the UK, Europe and the UK now. And basically this involves the use of open APIs that enable third-party developers to build applications and services that run on top of the bank's infrastructure and services. And the idea is to create increased portability of data between different banks and other financial service providers as well. So I should be able to go into yet another bank and say, I want my data from another bank moved to your bank. Please, can you connect to the API and move it all over so I can set up my accounts with you? This is a dream world, of course. It's not happening at the moment, certainly not in this part of the world. Although I know some banks, including Nedbank, have been experimenting with open banking APIs. But it's the early days, and the security implications of open banking are not well understood. From a purely technical perspective, probably it's not that difficult to secure these APIs. It's not to say that they won't be breached, because lots of things are not difficult and yet they get breached. But there's considerable potential for social misuse and creating new ways to hook customers into relationships all around your data. This is all to do with your data. So why should you be concerned? Why should you care? Because all of this has to do with your data. So what can data controllers do with your data? Well, they're actually only allowed to do a few things. They can gather your data only for the purpose of the business process in which you are participating. So if you go to a bank to open a savings account, the data that the bank needs for you to open that savings account can be used for that purpose and for the purpose of maintaining and sustaining you as a customer of the bank with that account. But those data can't be taken and sold to another company who's going to market to you on the basis of your spending habits, which the bank obviously knows about. That can't be done. That would definitely break all of the rules. So they can only gather the data that's needed for the specific purpose. Now it's easy to say these things. It's not so easy for consumers to understand. It's even not so easy for businesses to understand. And it's a huge gap, and one that is, I think, still difficult to fill, especially for smaller businesses that don't necessarily have the capital to hire a consultant to tell them and interpret it for them. Like the old days when the priests were the only people that could interpret the Bible, and you had to buy their services whether you liked it or not. You know, that's how it is. And nowadays the consultants who work in this area are the booming business. So the other aspect of what data controllers can do is they have to get your consent. But the challenge of consent is, what does it mean? So you go on to Facebook and you have two choices. You have to accept their terms and conditions, or you have to not join. You go to a bank and you want to open a bank account, you can accept their terms and conditions, or you can walk out the door. So the notion of consent is often, it's used very well to make sure that things are legal, but you may not actually be consenting to the things that you think you're consenting, because those TLDR, those things are too long, didn't read. Some of these service agreements, terms of service, terms and conditions are 30 pages long. That kind of consent isn't real consent, but there isn't any other form of consent that can be applied in those circumstances. So, what does it mean really to consent? So, I'm going to finish up now. I'm going to talk about, one of the aspects of caring is that you, as the owner of your data, have some responsibility, and that responsibility is, of course, to yourself. And you can't just outsource that and let someone else worry about it. You actually have to understand what's happening with your data, what it's being used for, and whether you're really okay with it or not. I have mixed feelings about some of the social media. I'm on it because I have to be on it, partly because of the nature of another business that I run, which I won't talk about here. You can't necessarily be completely off of those social media, but yet your data are being used in ways that you may not always agree with. When you sign up for something, whether it's online or on paper, make sure that you're aware of what data is collected, and what the purpose is, and what the data controller can do with it. And if you find out ever that the data controller is doing something with it that is not related to the purpose that you gave them consent, then you have a right to object to that. And if you don't agree with a use, either opt out of the option or you opt out of the service altogether. So lots of people have left WhatsApp in the last little while because of the change to their terms and conditions, but not because everybody went and read the terms and conditions, but because they saw lots of people talking about it on social media. And then lastly, but not least, on this side of the equation is exercise your right to be forgotten. If you're not happy with what's happening to your data on Facebook, delete your account and exercise your right to be forgotten. They have to provide that. On the other side of the equation, you need to look after your data. You need to look after critical information that can be used to identify you and to steal your identity or to try and scam you. So keep your systems updated. Make sure that you use secure passwords and multi-factor authentication. Follow good security behaviors. Understand a bit more about security. Make sure that you look after things. Strike the right balance for you. So what's a right balance for you might be not the right balance for me. So there are people who might want to go and live in a cabin in the woods, buy a truckload of aluminium foil and wrap it around the cabin to keep all radio waves out and just live off the grid completely. And there are others who are happy to go and expose whatever data is necessary for them to have a good experience on social media. I tend to be in that group. I tend to not worry too much about what happens to my data, but I'm also extremely concerned and careful about practicing good security hygiene. So it's a matter of striking that balance. But you need to protect your data because no one else is going to do it for you. Not even with the legislation like GDPR and POPIA. So I'm going to just finish up with an example, but here's an example of some of the obscure things that can happen when your data is out there, exposed, and cross-correlated. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can be identified from the data that's out there, but your browser can. So what happens, you go on social media, let's say that you're a Trump supporter and you're very right-wing and all of those things, and you're always searching for information about climate change being fake and all of those things. And you're getting all of this stuff and you're getting bombarded with advertisements for, underground shelters and things like that. And all of the social media posts that appear on your timeline are somehow linked with this notion of you being a right-wing person. And so what happens? You basically living in a self-reinforcing world of confirmation bias. And this is one of the nastiest aspects of the contemporary way in which your personal data are used. And I don't know how to get around it except to stay off social media. Well, I tend to use anonymous search engines like DuckDuckGo instead of Google, so that Google and Facebook don't cross-correlate my data. But it's almost impossible to completely avoid this scenario. I also, if I take Facebook as an example, I typically will have friends whose views I disagree with, because I'm frightened to death of being stuck in this world of confirmation bias where all we are is a bunch of people preaching to each other, preaching to the choir. And this is a very dangerous aspect of data in contemporary social media. So I'll finish up now, and I'll say that everything you do in a digital environment creates data about you. You have a role to play in ensuring your rights are protected and your data is looked after and is treated according to the rights that you are given under legislation. But ultimately, in today's world, data is very difficult to control. You can own it, but you may not be able to control it, and it may be very difficult to exercise those rights of ownership. Thank you, everybody. Bye.